She was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, and standing in the middle of a corporate lobby when security was called. Not because she posed a threat, but because someone in HR didn't like the way a black woman looked in a professional space. No raised voice, no policy violated, just the color of her skin and the size of her belly. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check credentials. They told her to leave the building while others watched in silence. What no one knew was that the woman they tried to erase was holding a truth powerful enough to bring a $1.9 billion deal to its knees. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about what happens when the world underestimates the wrong person. Watch closely, because nothing in this company will ever be the same. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which moment left you speechless. Maria Caldwell stepped out of the car and into the brittle morning air, her hand instinctively dropping to her swollen belly as she adjusted the strap on her worn canvas bag. Her shoes, cheap slip-ons stretched thin from months of wear, squeaked against the pavement, the sole of the left one nearly detached. She took a deep breath, the kind that braced her not for weather, but for what awaited inside the glossy lobby of Axiom Technologies. She'd made this walk hundreds of times, but today felt different. It wasn't just the fatigue in her limbs or the way the city's wind bit through her jacket. It was something heavier, lodged deeper than muscle or bone. As she approached the building, the receptionist behind the oversized marble desk barely looked up before motioning vaguely toward the side entrance, where service staff usually entered. Maria stopped, confused, then took 2 steps closer. The woman's eyes finally met hers and held a mixture of pity and dismissal. Maria raised her badge, and only then did the woman gesture silently toward the security turnstiles with a cold flick of her finger. Maria passed through without a word, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale sheen across the polished floor that made her reflection look faint, washed out, almost ghost-like. She pressed the elevator button and waited. When the doors opened, a man in a slim-fit suit glanced at her belly, then at the floor, and turned away without stepping in. The doors closed, and she was alone. On the 15th floor, her office buzzed with a quiet energy. Keyboards clicking, coffee machines hissing, muffled laughter from glass conference rooms. She stepped into the open plan area and immediately noticed her desk was empty. No chair, no computer, just a manila envelope resting where her monitor used to be. She picked it up, heart quickening, and pulled out a single sheet of paper with her name at the top and an HR watermark faintly printed behind it. The reassignment memo was terse. Effective immediately, her role had been redirected to off-site documentation review, stationed on the 3rd floor, known internally as the graveyard. No explanation, no meeting, just orders. As she stood there, a voice cut through the noise. Cameron, her direct supervisor, stood near the kitchenette with a mug in hand and an expression she'd learned to dread. Tight-lipped, amused, condescending. He looked her over slowly, eyes lingering on her frizzy hair, her stretched maternity shirt, the cracked skin around her ankles. "Didn't think you'd make it up here in those shoes," he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. A few chuckled behind her. She said nothing, just nodded slightly and turned back to the elevator. On the 3rd floor, the lights buzzed faintly. The space smelled of dust and old toner. Stacks of printed invoices, shredded paper bins, and boxes labeled 2009 lined the walls. She was assigned a desk with a broken keyboard and a plastic chair missing a wheel. There was no monitor, no access credentials, no welcome. A single sticky note sat taped to a folder with instructions in red ink. Sort by vendor. Flag duplicates. Report at week's end. She sat in silence for the next 3 hours, red pen in hand, her belly resting heavy against the edge of the desk. No one came to check on her. No one responded to her emails. When she tried to log in to the company portal, the system returned an error. Account not found. At noon, she went to the break room, a forgotten space with peeling linoleum tiles and an out-of-order vending machine. She stared at the blinking red lights on the machine until her vision blurred. Not from hunger, from something deeper, something that felt like erasure. As she leaned against the counter, a maintenance worker entered, nodded politely, then avoided eye contact. Even he knew what the third floor meant. On her way out of the break room, she heard a ping from her phone. A calendar update. Team lunch, upstairs conference room, RSVP required. Her name was not on the invite list. She checked Slack. Her access had been removed from the company's general channels. She searched her own name in the employee directory. Nothing. It was as if she had never worked there. Back at her desk, she resumed marking invoices with a silent rage she couldn't afford to show. At 5 o'clock, the lights dimmed automatically. No one told her it was time to leave. She walked to the elevator alone. Her shadow stretched long behind her, distorted by the flickering light. By the time she stepped into the elevator at Axiom Technologies, the low hum of corporate routine had already begun above her. But no one greeted her when the doors opened. No one looked up. Her badge still worked, but barely. It took 3 swipes before the door to the third-floor records room clicked open. She passed the same yellowed ceiling tiles and flickering lights, only this time, someone was waiting. Not HR, not her manager. Just a laminated note taped to the door with bold black letters. Report to basement level C facilities. Mireya paused, blinking at the unfamiliar directive. Facilities? She checked her inbox. No new messages. No meetings. No schedule. Just silence. She made her way back to the elevator and selected the basement level. Her reflection a ghost in the steel doors. When they opened, the floor smelled of bleach, cardboard, and heat from old machines. A short man in overalls handed her a key and motioned to a back hallway without a word. At the end of it was a double door marked Storage South. Inside, she found rows of metal shelves covered in dust and disorganized stacks of electronic waste, keyboards, printers, cracked monitors, old routers tangled with cable. In the center of the room was a gray cart and a mop bucket half filled with stale water. A clipboard hung from a hook nearby with her name at the top and the words Deep Inventory, Prep for Removal scrawled beneath. She stood motionless for a long moment, one hand resting on her stomach. Her job title was supposed to be Systems Data Analyst. She had signed contract. She had certifications. She had credentials. And now she was being handed a mop. The rage boiled low and quiet, like a storm forming underwater. She took a breath, picked up the clipboard, and began. As the day passed, no one came to check on her. No calls. No visitors. Just the constant thrum of HVAC systems and the scrape of plastic wheels across concrete. Around noon, she stepped outside the room and headed for the nearest restroom, only to find it locked. Her badge no longer opened it. She returned to her station and tried to push the anger down deep, but it pulsed behind her eyes. When she emerged after hours of sorting through piles of obsolete tech, Mireya carried a thick film of dust on her arms and the beginnings of back cramps that made her breath catch. As she walked through the service hallway, she passed a group of employees chatting near the break room door. They stopped talking when she approached. One woman in a tight maroon pencil skirt narrowed her eyes and let out a sharp laugh. Maybe if she knew how to dress for her size, people wouldn't mistake her for janitorial, the woman whispered, loud enough for Mireya to hear. Mireya didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She just walked past, eyes focused on the floor. She spent the next hour in a conference room alone, trying to log into the HR portal to file a complaint, but her login failed again. When she clicked Reset Password, the system told her the user account could not be found. She checked the company directory once more, still gone. No profile, no history, as if she had never existed. Later that week, Mireya's name reappeared in a mass email titled Staff Rotation Notice, listed as part of the Temporary Operations Support Team for Facility Transition. A polite way of saying storage duty. When she forwarded the email to HR asking for clarification on her reassignment and whether she would retain her current pay band, no one replied. Her calendar remained blank. The humiliation didn't stop at the storage room. Her lunch had been moved, literally. When she went to retrieve the Tupperware container from the employee fridge, it was gone. In its place was a sticky note, space reserved for team contributors. That afternoon, her desk on the third floor was completely cleared, all personal items boxed up and stacked near the emergency exit. Back in the basement, someone had written across her storage clipboard in red marker, "Do not assign technical tasks." The words circled in bold. One afternoon, while she was mopping near the freight elevator, an executive walked by with a group of interns in tow. He paused briefly, glanced at her belly, then turned to the group and chuckled. "Axiom always promotes internal growth," he said. "From the mailroom to the top. See? Proof right there." The interns laughed. Mireya stood frozen as the echo of their footsteps faded down the corridor. On her way out of the building that night, she passed by the main conference hall. Through the glass, she saw Cameron and the other department heads sitting at a long table, reviewing digital projections on a smartboard. Her name used to be listed on those decks. Her input used to matter. She stood in the hallway, invisible behind the tinted glass, watching people she trained take credit for her past work. She showed up early, unsure whether she had been accidentally included or purposefully baited. Either way, she sat quietly in the back of the sleek conference room, the only chair left wedged against the wall, directly under an air vent blowing a constant draft against her neck. The space filled with managers, junior associates, and technical leads, most of whom had not looked her in the eye since her reassignment. When the team supervisor, Randall Greaves, entered the room, all conversation ceased. He was a tall man with a permanent smirk and a voice that never dipped below condescension. He had once referred to her as the girl with the graphs, back when she corrected a mistake in his quarterly metrics. Today he stood at the front of the room with a remote in his hand and disdain barely masked behind his wide grin. He scanned the room, spotted her in the back, and chuckled loud enough for everyone to turn. "Well, look who made it out of the basement," he said, pointing a long finger directly at her. "Careful, folks. If she tries to get up too fast, we may have to call structural reinforcement." The room burst into nervous laughter. Mireya didn't move. She hadn't even stood yet. Her hand rested protectively over her belly, and her eyes remained locked on the screen. Randall walked to the head of the table, still grinning, and began clicking through slides of data infrastructure reports. Each chart, each trend line, each metric reflected work she had built or corrected. No mention of her name, no attribution. When one graph showed a spike in system errors from the week prior, she instinctively raised her hand. No one else moved. She cleared her throat and spoke. "There's a recurring trigger in the permissions framework. It's escalating non-admin tasks and corrupting access logs." Her voice was calm but assertive. The room went quiet. Randall stared at her, the smirk gone now, replaced by something sharper: contempt. "You're still following the code reports?" he asked, tone incredulous. Mireya nodded. "I was never removed from the diagnostic listserv. The errors matched the batch you flagged last quarter." Randall let out a dry laugh, then looked at the rest of the room. "Amazing," he said. "She's reading email in the janitor's closet and thinks she's back on the engineering team." Another ripple of laughter moved through the room, but it was quieter this time. Mireya stood slowly, wincing slightly as her back strained from the long hours and lack of ergonomic seating. She took one small step forward to elaborate, but Randall raised his hand to stop her. "Mireya," he said, voice lower now, laced with false concern, "we're all very impressed with your dedication. But maybe your focus should be on preparing for maternity leave. We wouldn't want you getting too worked up about things outside your job description." Her heart skipped, not from surprise, but from the confirmation that the humiliation wasn't incidental anymore. It was strategy. Every room she entered, every duty reassigned, every word spoken. It was all part of something deliberate. As if someone had decided that the best way to erase her wasn't to fire her outright, but to break her from the inside out. She stood motionless, her face calm, though her fingers dug into the fabric of her blouse. No one came to her defense. Not a single voice objected. Even those who had nodded along with her earlier insights avoided her gaze now. Randall moved on, turning back to his slides and pretending the interruption had never happened. The meeting droned forward, but she no longer heard the words. She heard only the buzzing in her ears, the pounding in her chest, and the shallow breaths she forced through her nose just to stay upright. When the meeting ended, no one spoke to her. The room emptied quickly. Some glanced at her as they passed, their eyes flicking away when she met them. One woman she had mentored 2 years ago muttered a weak sorry under her breath, but didn't stop walking. Maria waited until the room was empty before gathering her things. She noticed that the chair she'd sat in had a small stain on the cushion now. Cleaning fluid from the rag in her bag had leaked. It was the kind of thing someone would photograph and report to HR. She wiped it quickly, quietly, and left without a word. The email stated that due to recent behavioral irregularities and observed physical limitations, the company required her to submit weekly documentation from a licensed medical professional detailing her pregnancy's progress, current health status, and any predicted restrictions in job performance. It framed the request as a compliance measure designed to protect workplace productivity and ensure continued eligibility for active duty roles. The wording hit her like a slap. They weren't just trying to isolate her, they were building a case. She reread the sentence that labeled her as a potential liability to operational flow, and then reread it again. Her stomach turned not from nausea, but from something darker, something heavier. She was being documented, monitored, pushed slowly toward the door, without a single person ever having to say she no longer belonged. She forwarded the email to her doctor's office with a quiet apology, and then stared at the screen for a long time. 10 minutes later, a second message arrived. This one was from HR again, this time from a compliance coordinator. Attached was a file labeled Internal Performance Assessment Quarter 2. Her name appeared in bold across the top beneath the company logo, beneath the words Provisional Flag Cooperation Score Below Standard. She hadn't received a performance evaluation in over 6 months, and no supervisor had scheduled a review. Yet here it was, already finalized and already stored in her employee record. The assessment cited evidence of disengagement, disruption of meeting flow, and frequent unsanctioned commentary. Her jaw tensed. The meeting where she had dared to speak. That had been the trigger. What followed sent a chill down her spine. Embedded halfway through the document was a series of low-resolution photos. Her first thought was that they looked like surveillance stills. The timestamp was from 3 days prior. The location was unmistakable, the storage room in the basement. One image showed her hunched over a stack of old monitors, her hand resting on her stomach. The next showed her with her eyes closed, head tilted slightly back, her face pale, lips parted in exhaustion. She hadn't been asleep. She had paused for a moment to breathe, light-headed from standing too long, without food or rest. But the camera hadn't known that. Or maybe it had, and the intention was even more calculated. The caption beneath the photo read, "Unresponsive during work period documented for review." She sat still, her fingers curled slowly into fists on the keyboard. They had taken a moment of human weakness and twisted it into ammunition. Later that morning, a printed copy of the report appeared on her desk in the basement, sealed in an envelope with a post-it note. Sign and return by end of week. No explanation, no conversation, just another layer in the slow erosion of her status. The same day, she noticed her ID badge now beeped red when she passed the wellness room on the 4th floor, a space she had previously used to rest during lunch breaks. The system now marked her as unauthorized. She messaged IT support. They never responded. By Wednesday, the glances became more blatant. On her way to the supply closet, she passed 2 male employees whispering near the break room. One of them laughed and said, "Guess HR had to put bump patrol on the radar." She didn't stop. She didn't flinch. But inside, something fractured further. At lunch, she tried to sit at one of the tables near the employee garden. 2 young interns were already there. One stood, smiled awkwardly, and said, "Sorry, this is sort of reserved." The table had no sign. No one else was around. Maria nodded, moved on, and ate her sandwich in the stairwell between levels B and C. On Friday, just before the end of day, an HR representative named Shelby finally called her. The voice on the other end was sugary sweet, deliberate, and insincere. Shelby apologized for the formality of the medical verification email and said it was just company policy. She emphasized that the performance assessment was not punitive, merely informative. Maria asked when the photographs had been taken and whether she had been informed that the basement was under surveillance. Shelby paused for a moment too long, then replied, "All company spaces are subject to visual monitoring for safety purposes." Maria replied, "I wasn't made aware of that." Shelby didn't answer. Instead, she closed with a chirpy, "We're here to support you however we can." The call ended. That weekend, Maria reviewed every document HR had ever sent her since her hiring. Nowhere did it state that her workspace had active cameras. Nowhere did it mention real-time performance tracking beyond scheduled reviews. She began to suspect the camera had been installed specifically for her. The next Monday confirmed it. A small black device, previously unseen, had been repositioned directly above her new desk in the storage area. It blinked faintly, recording every movement. By the end of the week, she received another email. This one bore the subject line, "Early Planning Maternity Leave Logistics." It stated that based on her recent low cooperation rating and current workload reassignment, she would not qualify for the full duration of paid leave as originally discussed. Instead, she would receive partial compensation, contingent on future evaluations. No discussion, no negotiation, just a digital notice, silently stripping her of rights she had earned. But something had changed. Her desk was gone. In its place stood a crate of old keyboards and a roll of shrink wrap. A note taped to the wall simply read, "Relocated facilities, cleaning schedule expanded." She stood there for several seconds, her mind piecing together what that truly meant. They had removed her workstation entirely without notice. No email, no call, no explanation. She made her way up one flight to the 4th floor, where temporary staff and floaters were often assigned. At the far end of the corridor, past a row of unused lockers and the last stall of the women's restroom, she found a single desk wedged between a trash bin and a plastic utility shelf holding bottles of ammonia and industrial degreaser. The nameplate read M. Caldwell, handwritten in black marker on a recycled shipping label. A stained chair with one arm missing leaned crooked against the desk. The overhead light flickered inconsistently, and the wall behind her was warped from a past water leak. Her computer monitor had a crack along the bottom right corner, and the keyboard was sticky with something she chose not to identify. Her inbox had no new messages. Her calendar was empty. When she attempted to access the company Slack, the channel she had once created for cross-team infrastructure collaboration now listed her as removed by admin. She opened the internal portal for project tracking. Her name no longer appeared on any assigned team. Still, she composed a brief message and sent it to her former supervisor, requesting confirmation of her new assignment. The email went unread. A second message, this time to the internal support team asking for updated access to shared drive folders, remained unanswered after 2 full days. On Wednesday, she saw a white colleague, an entry-level analyst named Travis, send a similar request for access to the same folders. It was granted within 3 minutes, and the IT admin responded with a cheerful, "Let me know if you need anything else." Maria stared at the timestamp in silence, then clicked her message thread again to confirm. Unread. She wasn't just being sidelined. She was being scrubbed from the fabric of the company. That afternoon, a team-wide announcement went out via email congratulating the data optimization unit for completing the final stage of a high-profile rollout. Her name was nowhere in the credits, even though she had written the original diagnostic framework 6 months earlier. She clicked on the linked PDF presentation, scrolled through it slowly, and found one of her exact code segments in slide 23, still formatted in her preferred indentation style. No citation, no mention, just stolen work, neatly packaged, praised by the same executives who no longer acknowledged her presence in hallways. She forwarded the file to herself, quietly labeling it Evidence Authorship Redacted. She added it to her growing folder of documentation. On Thursday, she tried again to re-engage. She scheduled a meeting with HR, only to find the meeting link expired before it even began. When she called the main line, she was placed on hold for 17 minutes before a recorded voice informed her that the office was experiencing high call volume and disconnected. The same day, her company profile was altered again. This time, her job title was changed from Systems Analyst 2 to Operations Support Temporary Rotation. No email explained the change. No supervisor met with her to discuss it. It simply happened. The change was silent, deliberate, irreversible. The physical degradation of her workspace continued. Maintenance forgot to replace the flickering bulb above her seat. The janitorial staff left mop buckets in front of her chair. Her drawer handle broke. The scent of bleach and mildew was constant, seeping into her clothes and settling in her sinuses like punishment. One morning, she found her desk surrounded by yellow caution tape and a sign reading "Floor under review, do not enter." No work was being done. No hazard was present. She moved the sign aside and sat anyway. That Friday, a company-wide security alert instructed employees to reset their passwords due to a potential phishing threat. When Mireya attempted to reset hers, she received an error message. User ID invalid. She reported the problem to IT. No response. Hours later, a junior associate named Ellie mentioned in a Slack comment that she had resolved her reset issue super fast, with the same help desk. Mireya clicked into the comment thread. The support rep had responded to Ellie in under 2 minutes with direct assistance. She refreshed her own request ticket. Still pending. No timestamp. As the days passed, she noticed fewer and fewer employees looking her in the eye. The elevator doors often closed faster when she approached. Conversations near the vending machine ceased abruptly when she entered the room. Her reputation, once marked by excellence and clarity, was being rewritten without her consent. It wasn't just that they didn't see her anymore. It was worse. They saw her and chose to erase her in real time. At the end of the week, an internal memo was circulated outlining the company's new diversity initiative. The document boasted statistics, diversity ratios, partnership programs, and photographs of smiling Black and brown employees, none of whom worked at her branch. Mireya looked through the slideshow without emotion, then closed the file and added its file name to her folder labeled Optics. Her feet were swollen, her belly heavier now than ever, and the only dress she could still fit into had a broken zipper she repaired with a black safety pin and a strip of electrical tape. But she went anyway, not to network, not to smile, but to be seen, to remind them she was still there. She stepped into the atrium slowly, nodding to no one in particular, her palms damp against the fabric of the only clean shawl she had left. A few heads turned. Some looked away. Others simply stared at her, as if she were a misplaced fixture someone had forgotten to remove before the evening began. The CEO took the stage after 2 rounds of hors d'oeuvres and champagne. A round man with slicked back hair and the smug energy of someone deeply convinced of his own benevolence. He raised a glass and spoke about company growth, the importance of innovation, and the need for internal culture to reflect external excellence. Then his tone shifted, not obviously at first, but with a slow, surgical edge. He launched into a segment about corporate identity, about how success begins with presentation. He spoke of professionalism not just in output, but in appearance, in how we carry ourselves in front of clients, in front of each other, and in the mirror. The crowd chuckled politely. Then he said it. There's a fine line between being comfortable and looking like you've turned yourself into a walking circus tent. He smirked, his gaze drifting over the audience. No one closes a billion-dollar deal looking like they've just left a soup kitchen or a maternity shelter. There were laughs, some nervous, some genuine. Mireya didn't laugh. Her fingers dug into the sides of her chair. She was the only visibly pregnant woman in the room. The message landed exactly where it was meant to. She looked around. Not a single person looked back at her. She stood and left before dessert, returning to the dim 4th-floor desk that had become her cage. She sat in silence, her stomach cramping faintly as she dialed her OBGYN's number to reschedule an appointment. Her phone was pressed to her ear when the security team arrived. 3 men in black jackets stepped off the elevator and walked straight toward her without hesitation. One held a tablet. The others flanked him. The taller one spoke her name sharply. Mireya Caldwell. She looked up. The line went quiet in her ear. "We've been instructed to escort you off premises pending an internal investigation," the man said, his voice clipped, echoing in the near-empty hallway. "Suspension is effective immediately." She was still holding her phone, still listening to her doctor's nurse say, "Hello? Are you still there?" But the line cut off as the guard reached over and ended the call. The tablet was raised, the screen displaying a formal memo from HR with her name, employee number, and the words active status. Suspended investigation pending. She stared at the screen, the words swimming for a moment in her vision, blurred by disbelief and something deeper. Not fear. Not yet. First came confusion, then clarity, then fury. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent except for the heavy breathing of one of the guards and the faint buzz of overhead lights. She was not handcuffed, not touched, not threatened, but the way they flanked her made it clear she was not free to deviate. When the doors opened, she stepped into a full lobby. Dozens of employees gathering coats, sipping coffee, chatting beneath the tall glass panes as evening rolled in. The guards did not lower their voices. One read aloud from the memo, as if narrating for a camera crew. Employee Caldwell removed due to procedural conflict and HR violation under Section 3.17. Non-compliance with reassignment directive. The words were spoken like a verdict, and they echoed through the atrium like a siren. People turned. Conversations halted. Eyes tracked her as she was led across the polished marble. Someone pulled out a phone. A low murmur spread, growing louder with each step. She heard someone whisper, "What did she do?" And another say, "I heard she threatened someone." Another voice asked, "Wasn't she the one with the fake medical leave?" It all mixed together into a low, poisonous fog. But she kept walking, her spine rigid, her steps even. When the glass doors opened to the outside, the wind hit her like a slap. Cold, clean, and honest. No one followed her. No one called after her. No one helped her down the last step as she steadied herself on the frozen concrete. The guards waited until she cleared the security perimeter, then turned and disappeared behind the closing doors. Her breath came fast now, not from exertion, but from the pressure of everything pressing in from all sides. She stood there for a long time, motionless, one hand over her belly, the other gripping her phone as if it were the only real thing left in her world. She pulled up the HR memo that had been sent to her personal inbox less than 60 seconds after her removal. It contained a line that made her chest tighten. Return of ID badge and equipment required. Future presence on Axiom property may constitute trespass. They had already locked her out. They had already decided she was gone. No trial, no defense, just exile. Her breath curled in front of her like smoke as she removed her gloves with slow, deliberate fingers and reached for the second phone tucked inside the lining of her coat. It wasn't company issued. It had no biometric locks, no tracking, no shared contact directory. It was hers, and it was only used for one thing. She scrolled through a short list of numbers, less than 10 names, and paused over the one marked Executive Liaison Board Emergency Protocol. She pressed the call icon and raised the phone to her ear. The line connected after the first ring. A male voice answered without pleasantries. "Confirm identity." Mireya spoke her full name, slowly, clearly. Then she said the key phrase written into a clause of a contract very few people inside Axiom even knew existed. "Initiate emergency override. Convene board quorum within 12 hours. I am exercising Article 17, equity proxy on behalf of Caldwell Holdings." There was a pause. Then the voice on the line responded with calm efficiency. "Confirmed. Authority recognized. Quorum will be called. Should we notify legal?" Mireya's response was measured, firm. "Yes. And tell them to unseal the 2016 arbitration file. It's time." She ended the call and stood still, the phone warm in her palm. Around her, The world remained unaware that in a single minute, the course of everything inside that glass tower had changed. A woman they had tried to erase had just pulled the alarm built into the foundation of the very company they had stolen from her. Maria turned and began to walk down the street, her mind a flurry of memory and calculation. Years ago, before she took the analyst job under a pseudonym, before she erased her last name from every internal record, she had made a promise to her grandfather, Augustus Caldwell, founder of Axiom Technologies, that she would one day return not through the front door, but from the shadows, only when it mattered. Augustus had built the company with the intention that leadership would pass to those who understood the burden of building, not simply the privilege of owning. But when he died, the board shifted the structure, dissolved the family's operational control, and rewrote history through sanitized marketing campaigns and ceremonial titles. What they couldn't dissolve, however, was ownership. Maria had inherited shares through a silent trust structured with bulletproof legal layers. Her voting rights were dormant, contingent on specific conditions being met, conditions that had just been triggered by the public humiliation, the internal documentation of discrimination, and the systematic obstruction of her role. By the time she reached the street corner, she had already received her first encrypted message from legal. Confirmed. Shareholder stake at 22.3%. Officially eligible for emergency intervention. Proxy override rights granted. Meeting scheduled 7 a.m. She turned left, entered a quiet coffee shop, and sat near the window. No one noticed her. No one saw the woman who had been dragged through every corridor of injustice, quietly setting in motion the unraveling of the people who had written her off as a liability. She ordered peppermint tea and opened her laptop. The moment it connected to the private network routed through a VPN in Geneva, the system recognized her as Maria Caldwell, executive shareholder, legal stakeholder, proxy veto authority. She began uploading her documentation. Every memo, every photo, every manipulated evaluation, every time-stamped access log that showed how she had been gradually locked out of systems she once helped design. She compiled an internal dossier titled Ethical Violations and Material Risk 1.9b Contract Exposure, and attached a 12-page executive brief outlining potential legal vulnerabilities stemming from discriminatory practices and HR protocol violations. On page 4, she highlighted a clause in a pending contract that could void the entire deal if the company were found in breach of employee equity assurances. The contract in question? A $1.9 billion international merger scheduled to be signed in less than 48 hours. As she finalized the brief, another message arrived. Chairperson notified. Legal review active. Initial response from senior counsel. Exposure level critical. Her eyes didn't blink as she read it. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a small velvet pouch, and opened it. Inside was a signet pin bearing her grandfather's initials, forged from brushed platinum and jet. She pinned it to her coat, above her heart, and closed the pouch. She wasn't going home. Not yet. She had a boardroom to return to. At exactly 6:58 a.m. the next day, she walked back into the building from which she had been exiled less than 20 hours earlier. This time, no one stopped her. No guards. No desk check. Her badge, restored during the night by the CTO himself, flashed green when she scanned it. She entered the executive elevator, ascended to the 42nd floor, and stepped into a glass-walled boardroom where the most powerful people at Axiom sat in stunned silence. Some recognized her. Most didn't. The chairman looked up from the agenda notes, saw the platinum pin, and went pale. She closed her laptop gently and folded her hands over the table, looking at each board member without anger or demand, only the steadiness of truth long denied. No one spoke at first. Several executives exchanged glances, some anxious, others already calculating. The general counsel whispered to the chairperson, then stood and confirmed the necessity of an immediate internal audit, citing Section 9.1 of the Ethical Risk Clause. The room quickly transitioned from tense disbelief to panicked containment. Maria had not just pierced their culture of silence, she had detonated it. Over the next 24 hours, A full-scale investigation was launched by an external compliance firm specializing in discrimination litigation and equity review. Teams descended into Axiom's HR infrastructure, subpoenaing archived messages, internal evaluations, and access credentials tied to personnel actions across 3 fiscal quarters. Maria had laid the groundwork, but what the auditors uncovered went beyond even her expectations. Multiple departments had engaged in what the report would later describe as pattern-based attrition targeting, a coded term for strategic efforts to reduce diversity numbers under the pretense of performance metrics. Over 62 flag cases matched the pattern. Employees of color receiving sudden mid-cycle reviews marked non-compliant, lacking initiative, or culturally misaligned, followed by demotions, desk relocations, or elimination under budgetary downsizing. Worse, one senior HR executive had altered numerical evaluations using a hidden override panel embedded within the company's now-defunct legacy review system. These reviews, submitted after the fact, were never seen by the employees in question, but were stored in sealed folders accessible only to the VP of Operations and 3 high-level HR staff. One of those staff members, under threat of criminal prosecution, admitted during the second day of interviews that the policy had been nicknamed Quiet Exit Protocol, and that Maria's reassignment had been considered a test model for more aggressive rollouts later in the year. She told investigators it wasn't about the baby. They just didn't want her seen. She didn't fit the client image. Simultaneously, news of the investigation leaked. It started small. An anonymous post on an equity watchdog forum citing an unnamed Fortune 500 company facing an emergency ethics probe. But by the following morning, major business media outlets had picked up the thread. Bloomberg ran a headline: Tech giant Axiom faces allegations of systemic discrimination amid billion-dollar deal. CNBC ran with Insider report may derail Axiom merger. Internal racism claims surface. Social media exploded with the hashtag #ErasedAtAxiom. Former employees began sharing their stories, naming supervisors, recalling eerily similar experiences of being reassigned, silenced, erased. The impact was immediate. Stock value plummeted by 9% within hours. The legal team scrambled to issue controlled statements, but the damage had already eclipsed the boundaries of public relations. What truly detonated the merger, however, came from Geneva. The international firm set to finalize the $1.9 billion deal with Axiom, an energy analytics conglomerate with strict ESG compliance mandates, issued an emergency statement through its chief ethics officer. It read, "In light of current allegations and the ongoing internal investigation into discriminatory practices within Axiom Technologies, we have determined that finalizing our agreement would be in direct violation of our internal equity commitment and risk profile. Effective immediately, all negotiations are suspended. Contract terminated." The board convened again, this time not in a bright glass conference room, but via emergency teleconference late at night. The CEO, visibly shaken, tried to save face. "We were unaware of these practices," he said. "This doesn't represent who we are." Maria listened quiet, composed, knowing that she had warned them years ago when she first declined to join the family board seat and instead chose to work anonymously within the company. They hadn't listened then. Now they had no choice. The legal team informed the board that class action exposure was probable. Multiple affected former employees had already retained counsel. Labor organizations were watching. Regulatory compliance officers had been notified. The board voted unanimously to place the VP of Operations, the entire senior HR team, and the CEO under temporary administrative leave pending review. Quiet exits were no longer an option. Meanwhile, Maria's name, once erased from directories and documents, now trended across headlines. Not because she sought recognition, but because truth always finds its way to the surface when carried with enough clarity. Her face appeared not in glamour shots or studio lighting, but in a single photograph captured as she walked alone toward the boardroom in her worn black coat, eyes forward, jaw set, the platinum Caldwell pin gleaming under her collar. Calls poured in. Journalists, advocacy groups, compliance consultants, former employees thanking her. Current employees asking if she'd return. Board members, now aware of her full identity, began strategizing how to rebuild around her. But she ignored most of it. Her focus remained unshaken. She had done what needed to be done, not for power, for precedent. On the third day, the external audit firm released an interim report. Its conclusion was blunt. Cultural misconduct was not isolated. It was institutional. Corrective action is not optional. It is imperative. At the bottom of the executive summary, in bold, were 2 lines: primary whistleblower verified. Identity: Maria Caldwell. Status: shareholder, equity stakeholder. Leadership candidate pending appointment. She reviewed every draft, every sworn statement, and every system report with surgical precision. Her access, once stripped from her, was now unrestricted. Nothing moved without her notice. The firm's audit software traced 6 months of HR data, running pattern recognition on terminations, reassignments, and disciplinary action across the company's 8 departments. What it found was not just bias, but a coordinated mechanism of exclusion. Over 32 employees, most of them Black, Latino, or Southeast Asian, had been removed from their roles in the last half year, all under the guise of budget rebalancing, redundancy, or performance inconsistencies. But the performance reviews tied to those exits revealed language nearly identical across multiple cases, written by different supervisors but clearly derived from the same template. Words like lack of cultural alignment, underwhelming initiative, and passive communication style appeared over and over, flagged by the audit software as statistically anomalous and linguistically coded. Even more damning were the internal chat logs recovered from archived Slack threads and email chains, messages exchanged privately among HR staff and upper management that used casual, almost flippant tone to discuss the optics risk of maintaining too many non-core faces in client-facing roles. The head of human resources, Lorraine Piper, was the central figure. Her name appeared in nearly every flagged conversation. She had approved the performance downgrades, signed off on sudden relocations, and in some instances, personally instructed lower-level managers to document fatigue patterns or push formal coaching reviews for exit pathways. She even joked in one email that it was easier to tighten the pipeline before it overflows with quota hires. When presented with this during a closed-door hearing, she refused to answer. Her silence was interpreted as admission. She was terminated within the hour, her security access revoked, her name scrubbed from the company directory that same afternoon. Alongside her, 3 senior managers, 1 in product, 2 in finance, were also dismissed. They had colluded with HR to remove qualified employees under false pretenses, reshuffling internal budgets to fabricate reasons for downsizing diverse staff. One of them, caught in a recorded call, was heard saying, "I don't care if he's smart, he doesn't make the clients comfortable." The legal risk team classified the statement as direct evidence of workplace discrimination under Title VII. The last to fall was the CEO, not for direct participation, but for failure of oversight, negligence in governance, and public misrepresentation of corporate values. He had stood on stages, signed press releases, and built his brand around a false narrative of inclusion, while the very people most committed to that vision were being methodically erased from the halls of the company. The media had already begun its storm. Outlets from CNN to Fast Company ran exposés with headlines like Axiom's Diversity Illusion, a Fortune 500 case of discrimination in plain sight, and the silent layoffs. How inclusion was just a word on the wall. Financial analysts predicted long-term brand damage, and investor confidence plummeted. Within hours of the board's emergency press conference, confirming the firings and admitting a failure of leadership, the stock dropped 20%. By close of market that Friday, Axiom had lost $300 million in valuation. The shareholder forums were flooded with calls for further resignations. Institutional partners considered freezing investments until new compliance frameworks were independently verified. Employees who had once turned their backs on Maria now whispered her name with a strange combination of reverence and disbelief. Inside the company, a cultural shift began to take root. Team leads started revisiting exit reviews of past employees. several began inviting previously dismissed staff to speak confidentially to the ethics team. New internal channels were launched for anonymous reporting, and Maria was appointed to lead the oversight committee, with authority to restructure the very departments that once buried her. It wasn't power that guided her decisions, it was clarity, forged through suffering and sharpened by months of silence. She didn't make sweeping changes overnight. She listened. She asked questions. She reviewed old files late into the evening. She asked, not once but repeatedly, who else was pushed out quietly? Who else never had the chance to fight? Outside, the public's view of Axiom turned from admiration to scrutiny. Commentators on cable panels questioned how a company with so many resources could allow such blatant misconduct to metastasize. Activist groups held virtual forums titled, "When Visibility Isn't Enough," and cited Maria's case as an example of how proximity to power still didn't guarantee safety without structure, enforcement, and people willing to stand alone when no one listens. Meanwhile, former employees, the 32 erased in the shadows, began receiving formal apologies, settlement offers, and invitations to participate in the rebuilding process. Some accepted, others declined, but the acknowledgement itself became part of the healing. At the center of it all, Maria remained resolute. She didn't seek vindication through vengeance. Her strength wasn't in the destruction of others, but in the restoration of what had been systematically taken from her and from people like her. She returned to the same building that once pushed her out, no longer as an outsider, but as someone who had not just endured, but transformed the system that tried to consume her. People who once spoke over her now listened when she entered the room. Her new office wasn't the corner suite with skyline views. She declined that. Instead, she requested a space 2 floors below, where she could see the operations teams, where real problems surfaced first. In the months that followed the collapse and reckoning inside Axiom Technologies, the dust did not settle quietly. The ripples of what had happened moved outward in concentric waves, touching not just boardrooms and stock tickers, but human lives, those who had done harm and those who had watched in silence. One of the first to be seen again, not in power but in penance, was Randall Greaves, the former team supervisor whose public taunts in a company meeting had once drawn laughter at Maria's expense. He resurfaced not through headlines or scandal, but through a chance encounter. An employee from Axiom's compliance division spotted him on a volunteer shift at a nursing care facility 2 towns over, pushing a wheelchair slowly down a narrow hallway, guiding an elderly man toward a sunlit courtyard. When asked why he was there, he replied with no bravado, no bitterness. Because it's the first place where no one cares what you used to be. They just want someone who listens. He had taken the job quietly after losing his severance and being rejected from 3 interviews where his name had been flagged for reputational risk. The old confidence, the unchecked sarcasm, the dismissiveness, gone. In its place was something unfamiliar in him: humility. He wrote a letter to the ethics board at Axiom, unsigned but unmistakably his, saying, "There's nothing redemptive in what I did, but there is meaning in who I became because of it. I wish I had listened when it mattered. I wish I had seen her fully." Lorraine Piper, the former HR executive whose signature had finalized over 30 terminations, had gone silent in the aftermath of her firing. For weeks, no one heard a word. Then, without announcement, she published a sworn statement on an open-access legal archive, not filtered through legal PR, not curated for optics, but raw. In it, she admitted to manipulating data to preserve her department's standing with senior leadership, to editing performance reviews for employees she had never met, and to justifying her actions behind metrics that dehumanized the very people she was meant to protect. Her confession, titled "The Mirror in the System," ended with a single paragraph that changed how many viewed her legacy. It was Maria Caldwell who shattered the illusion I had built my career on. I thought I understood power because I had access, because I had influence, because I could make decisions without consequence. But real power is carried in silence, in resilience, in the refusal to surrender when the world has decided you don't belong. I don't ask for forgiveness. I ask that you let me build something new with what I have left. She used her remaining savings to co-found a nonprofit that supported Black and Indigenous women navigating corporate structures, providing mentorship, legal assistance, and access to equity grants. The first event they hosted was titled Speak Before They Erase You. Inside Axiom, the transformation Maria had initiated continued beyond structure and policy. Entire departments restructured reporting lines to eliminate bottlenecks where bias had once festered. Anonymous feedback loops became standard. Pay transparency dashboards were implemented. The new leadership team included not only diverse faces, but diverse voices, people who had once been dismissed as too quiet, too different, too junior. The language used in performance reviews changed. The cultural expectations shifted from conformity to contribution. People began to feel seen, not scanned. Mireya herself declined the permanent executive chair. She did not want her legacy to be that of the woman who took over after the collapse. She wanted to be remembered as the woman who proved silence was a strategy, but not a solution. She continued leading the Equity Oversight Council, guiding decisions that touched hiring, promotion, and ethical accountability. She mentored new hires, especially those who entered the company with the same quiet uncertainty she had once carried through those halls. When asked why she stayed, she often answered simply, "Because I want to leave the door open behind me." It was locked for too long. Her child, born during the final month of the company's restructuring, became a symbol of something no campaign could manufacture: endurance, new beginning, lineage not of blood alone, but of conviction. The baby's name was etched into a stone garden placed near the courtyard where employees often walked during breaks. A space once cold and ornamental, now turned into a living archive. One stone among many, placed beside others bearing the names of employees who had been wronged and later vindicated. The company never fully escaped its past, nor did it try to erase it. A permanent exhibit was installed in the lobby called Unwritten Histories, chronicling the stories of those whose voices had once been suppressed by internal policy, including audio recordings, documents, and testimonials. Mireya's story was not centered. It was simply one among many. She had insisted on that. In time, clients returned. Investors regained confidence, not because of image management, but because of demonstrated change. Axiom became known not for what it had once failed to be, but for what it had chosen to become after failing. In a panel hosted 1 year after the investigation, Mireya was asked what justice had looked like to her. She paused, then said, "Justice is not a verdict or a headline. It's when the people who harmed you no longer need to lose for you to win. It's when they change because they chose to, not because they were forced to. And it's when you can look them in the eye and feel nothing except clarity, not anger, not pity, just the knowledge that you did not become them to survive them." When she left the stage that day, the room rose, not in applause, but in silence, standing as if to mark not an ending, but the recognition of something irreversible. Mireya walked off not into victory, but into peace. The end. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Mireya was humiliated at the company gala, or when she took back control in the boardroom? Let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? And tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this message of justice and resilience is reaching.